opportunity to come and serve the word of the Lord. We'd like to welcome those that is joining us via Facebook, those that will be viewing the sermon, those that are currently viewing the sermon. We welcome you, and may our good Lord bless you. I have exactly 15 minutes just to share what God has laid. House churches that was made up of these two groups. And so in chapter 1, he would address them and the challenges that the Gentile church had, but he also addressed the challenges of the Jewish church in chapter 2 and chapter 3. He brings the verse that basically leveled the playing field for all of them as he comes and remind them that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so in chapter 7, we pick up the Apostle Paul directly addressing the Jews in this regard, because he writes to those who exactly would understood as he tried to highlight some of these issues. And in verse 13 of chapter 7, he speaks in continuation of the law, and he says, "Did that which is good then bring death to me?" And he says, "By no means. It was sin producing death in me to what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. For I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For I have a desire to do what is right, but not have the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil that I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but it's sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law that dwells in the members of my body. Oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of sin and death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. May the good Lord bless the reading of his word. When you pick up in chapter 7, the beginning verses, as the Apostle Paul is going to speak about the law and the challenge that he has found himself, he used the idea of a marriage. And the idea is that when the husband divorces the wife is not in a position to get married to another man, because then the woman can still be held liable because of the law. And she would be seen as the one that is violating the law But if the husband dies, then she can then marry another person. And so this idea he brings to us as it relates to being free or being in bondage. And he comes and he shares and says, likewise, we have died to the law as the children of God. And he later on would come and share about this idea that God has come to Jesus Christ and has brought freedom to us, that we are no longer bound by this law through the death of Jesus. Yes. I briefly, if I may, title this text, Lord help me because I'm at a crossroad. As I was sitting and looking into this message, I had a question for myself, knowing that oftentimes I find myself in devotions, I find myself in services, I find myself hearing the word of God over and over and over and over again, and I always wonder, but why do I still struggle when at times I was so committed and I ran to the altar and say, Lord, this area that the minister preached in is an area, Lord, that I want change, but I continue to find myself in the very same circumstance. It becomes a challenge when you continue to sit in the word being ministered. But yet you continue to have a challenge and a struggle. It is interesting when we read in chapter 7 that the Apostle Paul brings a lot of questions as he brings his own life into this story and talking about how sin has seized this opportunity to come as it relates to the law, because at the time of the law was transcribed and given, but there was nothing for the individual to hold on to this law. And he comes and he explained to us that he did not know what coveting was until the law came and said, you shall not covet. He did not know that coveting was in his heart and within his mind until the law came and said, listen, thou shalt not covet. And even though in his mind he did not want to covet anything, but covetousness was within his nature. And so when the law said, do not covet, that is when sin took an opportunity in his life and came, and the Apostle Paul find himself in a covetousness position. And he says, I was once alive, and then I died, because I realized to say that there was these laws that I had to live by, but there was nothing that could help me. And that's why later he makes the point that the law is spiritual. But he had this challenge of how does he live by this law? How does he continue to be obedient? Found himself in a predicament. Had a dilemma that the apostle find himself. He says, I delight in the law of God in my inner being. I know your word, Lord, and what it says. But I have this challenge. And so God helped him to deal with as he identified Christ, he says, I was helped with this idea of having the law that continue made me die, because sin took the opportunity, and so now sin control this space in my life, and yet there is this desire in me that want to please God, but there's also something in me that is pulling my attention towards something else. And as he comes and speaks about this, he asks the question, did that which is good and bring death to me? And he says, by no means. And then he goes into the issue of addressing the idea of sin. This idea of sin that continued to remain within our lives, continue to dominate our lives. The law of sin is in opposition to even the law of God that we find within ourselves. It is working upon humanity through the flesh. That's what sin does through the flesh. You see, when you get saved, it doesn't make you a robot after that. When you're in the worship team, it doesn't mean, listen, that you are immune to challenges. When you preach, it doesn't mean that you are immune to certain things. No. What is happening is that through the flesh, it brings bondage and ultimate death to those captured under its domination. That's what sin does when it comes into our life. You see, the human predicament, it says it's one of the highest tributes ever paid to man. And Shakespeare come and as he talks about man, he says, where in Shakespeare's Hamlet, he says the opening scene we read, what a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable is man. He says in action, how like an angel in apprehension, and how like a God. And then he says, yet from this lofty ideal of man, from this wonderful, admirable things from man, he said the plot descends to show that man is involved in immorality and with the consequences of guilt, shame, and tragedy. He continued to say this. He says, even though man have this lofty place, he says, yes, there is the disposition of man also in terms of where you can find yourself. The 1 minute you could be wonderful Mrs. So-and-so, and the next minute you could be a battered woman finding yourself on the street. And so he says, yes, even though there's this lofty place for man, he says, yet there's this other place that one can find themselves. He says, with God-like qualities and unlimited potential, he finds himself living far below his possibilities. This is what the Apostle Paul acknowledged and realized in chapter 7. He realized that there's this God-like qualities and unlimited potential within me, and yet he finds himself below that possibilities, because he says the things that I want to do is the things that I don't do, the things that I try to avoid. That is what I find myself doing. What he says, there's this unlimited potential. Have you ever find yourself in a place where there are things that you wanted to do and find that you're not doing it? Understanding to say that, listen, you find a sermon and you came into the chapel and you said, I've heard about anger and how the Lord can deliver. And you said, Lord, please deliver me. And you walk out of here and anger comes your way. And you know that I said I'm not going to do it again, but end up doing it. There are many that says I'm never going to sleep out again. And they end up sleeping out only the following morning to say, I did what I did not want to do. Have you ever find yourself? Contemporary psychologist bears impressive testimony to this idea, to the power of wrong attitudes and subtle motivations as a destructive element to life. It is there. You're serving God. You're worshiping. You're a pastor. You're doing wonderful things. You're a leader. But there is this power of wrong attitudes and subtle destructive to the human life. In verse 20, the Apostle Paul gives us the reason for his dilemma. He says, listen here, that there is this thing that dwells within me as sin. And how often do we as believers and God's children, we walk around like we don't have sin. In fact, we don't preach about sin anymore. We don't talk about repentance anymore because we have this idea, listen here, that there is no longer sin. I don't sin. I'm a pastor, I'm a leader, I'm a student at Bible college. I don't sin. The Apostle Paul comes and reminds us in verse 20. He says, now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but it's sin that dwells within me. The fact that you and I don't want to acknowledge that sin is dwelling in us doesn't mean it is not there. And the Apostle Paul had to come and learn this and says, listen, sin that dwells within me. And then he said, so I find it to be a law that when I want to do the right thing, I find myself doing the wrong thing. I don't know about you, but I oftentimes find myself in that space where I know that I need to go right, but the desires of the world and the entertainment and the wonderful things is what we experience. And oftentimes we find ourselves, do I lie or do I don't lie? If I lie, it's going to be good. If I tell the truth, there's going to be issues, and you're found between these two. But what do you do when you find yourself wanting to do the right thing and end up doing the wrong thing? It says, for I delight in the law of God in my inner being. There's a desire of me that want to serve you, Lord. There's a desire for me to want to do the right thing, but I realize there's something also that pulls me. I know your word, Lord, and what it says. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Paul says, I delight in the law of the Lord. I know what it says, that I need to trust you, but God, I'm going to do my own thing anyway. Because why, even though I know that your word says, those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, but God, I'm not going to wait. I delight in your word, that there's a desire in my inner being for your law. But the time is running out, Lord. There's a desire to trust you. But I've run out of patience. I love your law, Lord, but there's still issues that I have that I'm dealing with. I love your law, and it places us in a dilemma, because why? On the one hand, I acknowledge to say that, listen, I love the word of God. I love studying his word. I love the church, but there's something in me that does not go with delighting in your law, and oftentimes it comes with justification to say the Lord understand. The law of sin is in opposition of God's law. And it keeps us in bondage. It says sin does worse for a man than he could ever imagine. It makes him an enemy to the one who loves him, and it also makes him a captive to the one who hates him. Let me say that again for you. It said sin does worse for a man than he ever could imagine. It makes him an enemy to the one that loves him, and it also makes him a captive to the one that hates him. And this is kind of where that we find ourselves, because why the battle that the Apostle Paul has, that he comes and remind us that he delights in the law of God, and then he says in his mind there's this members that's waging war, and the war is that there's a one who loved me but have become an enemy to him because why I have sin in my life. But at the same time there is the other one here that have taken me captive and that hates me. And so the war in my mind is, listen, I know you love me and that you care for me, but on the other hand, the desire of me having pleasure is pulling me towards being captive in sin. And I'm at the crossroad. I don't know about you, but I've oftentimes find myself at the crossroad. Do I get involved, or do I honor God? Do I gossip, or do I refrain from speaking about that person? Do I lie, or do I tell the truth? Because I'm at the crossroad, Lord. I know what your word is saying to me. And the Apostle Paul comes and says, listen, while I'm at this war within my mind in regards to this law that is waging war against the law of God in my life, and I find myself at this crossroad. He says, I'm a wretched man. He says, oh, it's done with me. He says, I know your law. It's in my inner being. I study your word. I know Greek terms. I have degrees. I know these things, but for some reason I don't do them. Says, I'm a wretched man. And then he comes with the question of, he says, who will deliver me? He says, I need deliverance. He says, who will save me? You see, this is the kind of saving that nobody else knew he needs saving. Only he knew he needs saving. Because he knew there's this wrestle inside of him. He alone knows at times when I must go left, I go right. Many people find themselves, do I talk to that lady knowing that I'm married, or do I think about, listen here, it's only going to be a one time, and I know that it is wrong, but listen here, I'm the only one that know it, nobody else. And I sometimes wonder how many of us that's sitting in this building probably have that war in you and nobody knows. How many times you wrestle? It is said that temptation has not become sin simply because desire has been awakened. It doesn't mean that you have sinned because the temptation have come and the desire has been awakened. It says temptation becomes sin only when the world decides in favor of the suggestion of the one that tempts you. And how often we are tempted as the children of God. It said it becomes sin. And that is often what happened with us. We are never jumping into sin. No. That's always, as the children of God, we are always tempted with sin. The enemy comes and always tempts us. And he says, listen here, it is not a sin because desire has been awakened. It becomes a sin when the world decides in favor of the one that tempts me. And so this is what I realize. It gets to the place where I need to make the decision to say that, listen here, will I let my world go in favor of Satan tempting me, or am I going to just remain in this place and pray and say, Lord, would you help me, as the Apostle Paul prayed and said, I know the Lord will save me through Jesus Christ. At times the battle is so intense and the child of God is perplexed. The wrestle inside of you, complications, you're confused, it hampers your growth, there's uncertainty. It says, you are perplexed because of the intensity of the desire and the length of the conflict. See, the longer you keep it, the longer you wrestle, the longer you can't decide at the crossroad which way are you going. The longer it lingers on, it becomes more intense because of the length of that wrestle within your life and that conflict. I want to love, but why can't I? I want to pray, I want to be good. As I close, you see, as long as the will of God is held steady and it aligns with His principles, it will continue to keep you against evil. But you see, this is the text that it is the scholar C.H. Dodd that comes and writes as he writes a commentary on the life of Paul and he coins faith in relation to Paul. He says it is an acknowledgement of the complete insufficiency to reach the higher ends of life, and the acknowledgement that God has all sufficiency to keep me. Yes. And as I read this, I understand where Paul found himself before, because Paul understood to say that, listen, even though I am this great Paul, even though I have this great ministry and a great testimony of Damascus, even though that I'm this guy, he says, listen here, that the place that I find myself in, I'm not going to reach for what I know. I'm not going to reach for the title that they have given me. I'm not even going to reach for people that I know. The Apostle Paul says, listen, my faith tells me that I need to acknowledge that there's a whole lot of insufficiency in my life to attain the goal that God has for me. And that is to acknowledge that He has all sufficiency. The reason why we can't get out of our crossroads is because why we're still dependent upon what we know, who we know, and why we know all these things. And you can't. I've become sensitive to people that disappear out of church. They're with us, they serve, they become members, we celebrate with them, the children get baptized, everybody is wonderful. And 4 or 5 years down the line, while we're still continuing to serve, we wonder, but where is so-and-so? They're no longer with us. Someone said, no, they haven't been now for the last 6 months. I haven't seen them. They wrestled with themselves. And they wondered, who's going to save me? Yeah. My marriage is falling apart and I'm wrestling. Who's going to save me? In church and wrestle with pornography and you wrestle with unforgiveness and you wrestle with anger and the longer it continues, you sit there and you wonder who's going to save me, and there's a desire in them that they want to serve God. That's why they're part of the church. They want to live for the Lord, but there's this other thing that's called sin in their lives that's pulling them in another direction. And the Apostle Paul knew to cry out to God to say, Lord, save me from the wretched man that I am. But many of them just slide out of the church. That's why I titled it, Lord, I'm at the crossroad. Help me. I know all the Greek terms. I'm the dean of the college. I'm the deist, I'm the pastor. But nobody knows I'm at the crossroad. But I'm too proud to scream out, Lord, help me. And may God help us. That when we find ourselves at that crossroad of, do I go left or do I go right? That God would help me. Because the longer it continues, it says that you become in bondage and enslaved. And so may the good Lord help us that we would not only hear the words. I was always concerned about, I hear so many sermons, Lord, why am I not where I'm supposed to be? Because I realize there's another war in me and I'm at the crossroad. Let us all stand. You see, this is one of those messages that doesn't matter what you know. This is a message it doesn't. In fact, I think because of what we know got us into trouble. The Apostle Paul says, I didn't know what covetousness is until the law. Lord, I didn't know what gossiping is until I read what your word says about gossiping, and all of a sudden I realize I'm in trouble. And so what I didn't know was much better than what I know. Well, when I wasn't a pastor, I was good. Until I became a pastor and got to know all these teachings, and I realized I'm in trouble. And so it's not what you know, but it's who you know. And it's crying out to God to say, save me, I'm at the crossroad. And God delivered the Apostle Paul, and God can deliver all of us. Let us go into a short word of prayer, and then I will close just the service.